but also people of the centre who will suggest that the only way that the logjam can be broken is if President Macron himself resigns. And then we're into a full-blown crisis of the whole of the regime.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Will Kingston. Charles de Gaulle once pondered, how do you govern a country that has 246 variety of cheese? Turns out with some difficulty, and it's not just because of the cheese. French politics has always had a unique set of challenges, and that is certainly the case today. Prime Minister Michel Barnier has forced through, using special powers, a budget bill without taking that to the Parliament. This has triggered a vote of no confidence, which, if successful, may spell the end of his government and possibly the end of the Fifth Republic. To discuss further, I am delighted to be joined by Robert Toombs, Professor Emeritus of French History at the University of Cambridge, and Professor John Keiger, Spectator contributor and former Research Director of the Department of Politics and International Studies, also at Cambridge. Gentlemen, bonjour.
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 It is a delight to have you both here. John, I will start with you first. Get us up to speed. What is the state of affairs as we record this on the morning of the 3rd of December?
Well, at the moment, we're waiting to hear what's going to happen on Wednesday. So that's tomorrow. Tomorrow there will be a vote on the censure motion, and that will decide the outcome of the Barnier government. If, as is very likely, the extreme left and the centre left, together with the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's troops, vote together, which in itself is a bit of a thing. If they both vote together, then Barnier will collapse and his government will collapse. And then we're into a whole new exciting ball game, I think, for many observers. Perhaps not so exciting for Emmanuel Macron, who will have to try and sort all of this out.
You mentioned Emmanuel Macron there, John. What must he be thinking as this crisis, and I think we can call it a crisis, unfolds?
Well, he at the moment is in Saudi Arabia on a trip that had been planned for quite some time. And so he's well away from everything. And the press keep, the media at least, who are present with him, trying to get him to say something about this. But he has often had that statement that he would not make comments on domestic politics while he's abroad, although he's broken it several times. So up until now, anyway, he said nothing. But if the ball will be in his court, and he will have to decide a number of things. He can take a number of steps. I don't know if you want me to go into those, but some of them are fairly radical, and others are more mundane.
Well, let's start with the fun ones. What would those radical ones be?
Well, a radical one would be that he could declare that France is in such a state of turmoil that its institutions are threatened, and that consequently he can activate what's called Article 16, which would give him supreme powers in many ways, decree powers anyway, that would allow him to make a number of decisions about France without going through Parliament. Now, that would be extremely radical, and the chances of him being allowed to do that are slightly complicated. The less radical things are choosing a new prime minister. And that in itself is going to be pretty difficult. As we saw with the Barnier appointment back in September, it is extremely difficult with the nature of the Parliament at the moment and the way seats are distributed for there to be any majority possible. In fact, it's highly unlikely. So the Parliament, the National Assembly, is divided into three parts, and those three parts really do dislike each other. So the chances of them getting together in some kind of majority to support a new prime minister are extremely thin. And that makes the position very difficult. So what could happen next? Well, if he can't form a government, then there are requests by the part of a number of political opponents, but also people of the centre who will suggest that the only way that the logjam can be broken is if President Macron himself resigns. And then we're into a full-blown crisis of the whole of the regime. Now, there's nothing to make him resign. He can decide of his own volition that he wants to go, and then there would be a presidential election. But the big problem would be that would not necessarily free up the logjam, because the Constitution doesn't allow for another legislative election that would change the majority within the National Assembly to happen before the 9th of June 2025. So it means that whoever would be appointed as president would have to deal with the same difficult National Assembly that Michel Barnier has had to deal with and failed. And therefore, the President of the Republic would be in great difficulty in not being supported by a parliamentary majority.
Well, the way that I interpret that, I don't think it's going too far to say that this is an existential crisis for the Fifth Republic. And with that in mind, I think it's probably worth taking a step back and thinking about the Fifth Republic in a historical context. And this is where I'll throw it to you, Robert. Take me through, what were the original aims of the Fifth Republic? And as we reflect on it at this incredibly serious moment, how successful do you think that the Fifth Republic has been in pursuing those aims?
Well, I don't think I'm being entirely flippant in saying the principal aim of the Fifth Republic was to solve the problems left by the French Revolution, from which France took a very long time to recover, if it has ever recovered. And what happened, leaving aside all the bloodshed, all the violence, is that France slowly oscillated over the decades between more democratic and often parliamentary, or at least more democratic and liberal systems, and more authoritarian systems. When you were in the period of an authoritarian system, you tended to blame all France's woes on the previous liberal system, accused of instability, of being unable to stand up for the national interests and so on. And when you're in an authoritarian system, in which in a sense we are now, you blame it on the constitution of the Fifth Republic as it is now, and in a way with justice. But France has been through an awful lot of constitutions since 1789. There's a whole volume of them. And I think a lesson from that is to say that they do not actually solve your problem. We often tend to think if you only had a good system, then you wouldn't have such problems as we now have. But there is no good system. There's a series of more or less bad systems, but there's no perfect system of government, and the sort of problems that France has are not going to be solved by constitutional changes. But the Fifth Republic was another of these oscillations towards an authoritarian system after a period of, let's say, more parliamentary government, which led to political instability, frequent changes of government, because Parliament could easily bring governments down. And so the Fifth Republic constitution was drawn up, of course, for de Gaulle, in order to create what he thought and his followers thought would be a system in which order and political stability and a coherent set of policies could be adopted. And also, actually, at the time when de Gaulle came to power, France could be pulled out of another existential crisis, which was that over the Algerian War of Independence and the possibility of this causing a civil war in France or a military coup in France. And so de Gaulle was brought in and given extensive powers, first of all, to solve that problem. But then the right, let's say, putting it rather crudely, the right had always thought, for a very long time, for a century, that the answer to France's problems would be a stronger central authority. This is the cheesist issue, if you like. How do you govern a country with so many sorts of cheese? Well, you have a very strong central authority, and that central authority will somehow be able to master all the problems. And so the problem we're in now is sort of hoist with its own petard, is that, as John as John pointed out, there isn't an obvious way out of this because the Constitution deliberately closes off many of the things that would happen in other countries. The government would fall, there'd be a parliamentary election, etc. In this case, deliberately, the Fifth Republic Constitution tries to limit the powers of Parliament by all sorts of constitutional devices and strengthen the power of the president. But what happens when, as you now have, a president who's in office but not in power, and a parliament which is fixed in a position which no one can actually make decisions? So that's where we are. And I think, as I say, if you want to understand it fully, you have to go back quite a long way into French history, and it's the various traumas and disasters that the French have tried to surmount by bringing in a new constitution.
Can I just interject there with just something that backs up what Robert's just said? But the moment we're at is quite obviously a crucial moment, as we've already pointed out. But the historical bells are ringing as well, because the last time that a censure motion was actually passed, in the only time in the history of the Fifth Republic, was back in 1962, when it was General de Gaulle and President de Gaulle and Prime Minister Pompidou who were in power, and there was a censure motion that was voted against Pompidou and brought the government down. General de Gaulle then just reappointed Pompidou straight afterwards in a sort of nose thumbing at his adversaries. The second thing is that the Constitution is extremely, as Bob said, extremely rigid. And this question of there not being the possibility of any legislative elections now until June, at the very earliest, and probably not until September, because the Constitutional Council would not allow elections to take place during the summer, means that this will go on probably until at least September or October 2025. So the mess is not going to be sorted out very quickly.
I'm intrigued by the decision-making calculus of Barnier this week. He must know that he is walking the plank by refusing to further acquiesce to the demands of Marine Le Pen. Is this actually a rare show of political principle at the expense of one's own career? Or am I perhaps being a tad naive?
Well, there are two schools of thought about Monsieur Barnier. The first is that he came in with a certain amount of arrogance as a result of having successfully, in his view, and to a certain extent in the EU's view, in having negotiated the Brexit agreement. And what Barnier had done during the Brexit period was that he consulted everybody, including right down to, if I remember correctly, people like Sinn Féin and other parties. So everybody was consulted, and he's been doing that recently. But what he has found, apparently, on coming into the French Parliament, is that it is far more aggressive, far more violent, far more excessive than anything that he had imagined. He lives a little bit in the past, I think, from his experience of French politics, which he's known quite a lot of. And therefore, his ability to bring together groups that really do hate each other is very, very difficult. And so he's failed. The second view of him, which is a more, complimentary view, is that he is a gentlemanly person, that he has principles, that he is not going to compromise those principles, and that therefore he is standing down because he doesn't think that he will be able to, or he's quite convinced that he's not going to be able to achieve what he attempted to achieve. Therefore, it must go to somebody else. I mean, I think he is a courteous, nice, gentlemanly person, but I think that he has misunderstood the nature of the present National Assembly and is quite out of his depth in many ways in being able to get because he's running two very difficult problems. One, he's got to reduce this gigantic deficit that the French have, their budget deficit and also their national debt. And secondly, he has got to form a government and run a government. And the two of those things don't seem to be compatible for him. He gives away money very, very easily and then takes it back again the next week. So it isn't the very best of ways to run a government.
Yes, we'll return to the politics of debt and deficit in a moment. But before we do, I want to hone in on the figure of Macron. He obviously was weakened by the elections in the summer. He is unpopular in France today, and this surely won't help him. How do you think that this saga will impact his legacy in France?
Well, I think his legacy is very likely to be disastrous. I mean, he's a very intelligent man, a man of great qualities. I mean, I once saw him when he was newly elected. When he came to England, and he attended a meeting, a sort of reception with Theresa May at the time. And poor Theresa May was standing in a corner on her own, and Macron was surrounded by admirers. And also Macron gave a rather brilliant improvised speech in English, and Mrs. May was able to, with great difficulty, read a few French sentences off a piece of paper. And I thought, this man is very clever and very able. And I remember one French journalist once saying, he's always been the cleverest man in the room. And that's how he's been brought up. And I think this certainly has led to an assumption that he knew what to do and he could do it. And he was right. And in some ways, it's true. To try to put up to reduce the financial deficit, to increase the age of retirement, these were very sensible things to do. The thing is, he's not been able to do them. He hasn't been able to take the country with him or explain to people why these somewhat painful things are necessary in a way that was done in this country with hardly any debate. You may remember after the 2008 crash, we put up the retirement age pretty quickly, and it's an obviously sensible thing to do. But to the French, it's an attack on their hard-won rights, and Macron seems less and less a person who is able to convince people and take them with him. He appears to be, and perhaps is, arrogant, tactless, convinced of his own superiority. And when he began in office, this impressed a lot of people. This Jupiter idea, he would be a remote but dominant. And this has all collapsed. And I think his legacy is going to be one of complete failure and possibly of national disaster.
John, I want to pick up on a line that Robert said there, which is how Macron has been unable to take the French public with him. He has been unable to tell a story. Feels to me like this is a common trend across Western governments in being unable to sell the politics of addressing debt and deficit. The elephant in the room in the last US election was the deficit issue or the debt issue that the US has. Trump and Harris didn't want to touch it. I don't think there's much appetite in the UK. There isn't any appetite in Australia. All of these countries are just amassing huge amounts of debt. Barnier at least appeared to be trying to address that, and he failed it seems likely he will fail in that goal. Is it possible to sell the politics of debt reduction in the age in which we live?
You can get a free bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label Whiskey when you subscribe to The Spectator in our Black Friday sale. Go to spectator.co.uk/Friday24.
Well, I think it is, because there are certain countries that have maintained a fairly low debt, and yet they went through the same problems that we went through, which are usually used as the excuses for the high debt, such as obviously the COVID era and also the Ukraine war. But if you look at the debt and the state of the finances of, say, Germany or Holland or some of the Scandinavian countries, then you can see that it is possible to manage your debt and to remain reasonably secure as a relatively stable government. Of course, Germany is in a difficult period at the moment, but overall, its debt is pretty small, around about 60 to 70% of GDP, whereas France is now up to 110, 115. And they're running budget deficits which are very small, if not surpluses, whereas France has a budget deficit at the moment of 6.2% of GDP, which is way above anything that is allowed under the European Union's rules. And therefore, France is at the moment on trial in a way for being asked by the European Commission to reduce its debt and to reduce its budget deficits. And if it doesn't do that, then there are all sorts of measures that could be taken against it. And already in France, people are talking about scenarios similar to what happened with Greece in, say, the 2012 period. So there is great concern, but it can be done. How France will do it, though, is going to be the $10,000 question.
The figure that looms over this conversation that we haven't spoken about much yet is, of course, Marine Le Pen. John, you said in The Telegraph, I think a week or so ago, a fascinating little line, as Western elites continue to discover when slamming the door on nationalist parties, they have a habit of clambering in through the window. What did you mean by that?
Well, I suppose I meant that that in the case of Marine Le Pen, and of course the examples elsewhere in the world are fairly obvious. In the case of Marine Le Pen, there has constantly been, and with her father before that, attempts to ensure that they don't come to power and that they are somehow ring-fenced and kept away from the real activities of the National Assembly, even if they have substantial representation within the National Assembly. So Marine Le Pen has something like 145 deputies at the moment, but hasn't really been able to participate in any aspects of government. She's been kept out of that by Michel Barnier, and indeed one of the reasons why she changed her mind fairly recently about supporting the government is because she feels that she's been dismissed by the Barnier government, hasn't been taken seriously by him, and consequently her voters don't feel happy, and they have been pushing over this last weekend to say enough is enough. We don't want any more of this. Therefore, you should censure the government and let's get back to something that doesn't really exist as a form of Macron's policies extended through Barnier. Let's go for something different. And here we are.
Robert, this goes beyond mere personalities. Macron and then Le Pen almost represent two different philosophies of politics, with this sort of technocratic centrism on one side and populism on the other. How do you reflect historically on how those differing schools have, I guess, been in tension with each other? And looking forward, do you think this is an opening for the populist movement in France?
Well, the old Irish joke, how do you get to Dublin? I wouldn't start from here. This is not a time you would want to come into office. If you were Marine Le Pen, you wouldn't want to be suddenly asked to be prime minister or elected president. The problems are not going to go away. And, the thing, of course, the classic thing about nationalist parties is that they are very good in opposition and they are almost invariably disappointing in government, because nationalism, as a form of populism, if you like, offers an enemy. It offers a simple explanation. It's able to give a lot of people hope that there will be some great change that will solve their problems. And then when nationalists get into power, they often just can't do it. The obvious recent example is that of Mrs. Meloni in Italy, who was regarded as being a sort of, someone who set the house on fire, but has not actually done very much. And it reminds me of a thing that one of our colleagues at Cambridge, Chris Bickerton, has written about the EU. And I've often wondered if John agrees with this. Chris Bickerton, Professor Bickerton, has said that what the EU does is to transform national states into member states. National states in which the power of the government comes from the electors, and member states in which the power of the government comes from other governments in the EU and from the EU's central institutions. And I think, we've seen in other countries, Greece being another obvious example, that you get parties coming into office with promises to do radical things. And then once they're there, they find they can't, because it's the EU and the EU institutions, and particularly the European Central Bank, that put limits on what they can actually do. And I just wonder if that's the situation that France is now in. The fact that Macron has been for quite a long time able to more or less ignore the national electorate, is that one of the symptoms of being a member state, not a nation state? And is this same structure of power, which is, as it were, horizontal rather than vertical, not going to continue to operate whoever is in office?
Well, yes. I think Chris Bickerton is spot on. It's very clear that the EU, through legislation, something like over 50% of French laws have come out of Brussels directly or indirectly. And it means that, to a large extent, the National Assembly is just a sort of recording chamber for things that emerge from Brussels. And this is why, at the moment, for instance, the farmers are extremely upset, because they are insistent that the EU legislation on all of the things that they do in their everyday lives is where the decisions are made, and that the National Assembly, when it attempts to do something, as it has been trying to do over the last year or two since the demonstrations of the farmers, it is unable to do anything. Because in the end, the decision-making lies in Brussels, and that is the only place that you can get to. But as a number of those officials are permanent officials, they're not elected officials, then it's very hard to have any control over them from within national states. So the Bickerton interpretation of member states rather than national states is indeed an appropriate one.
Let's turn to how this will impact both the European Union and the UK. Perhaps to the UK first, John, and I'll stay with you here. Keir Starmer would be watching his fellow technocratic, managerial bedfellow with interest. What do you think, if anything, this how do you think Keir Starmer will reflect on this situation, and will it have any ramifications for the United Kingdom?
Well, Robert might have something to say about this, but obviously how he ought to react and how he will react are not the same thing. How he ought to react is that he ought to see this as a kind of warning, really, about what would happen if Britain allies itself too closely with the European Union, as seems to be something that is being suggested, even though it would not be necessarily a return to the single market or anything of that nature. But drawing itself closely to the European Union, and even drawing itself closely to France, there are all sorts of indirect consequences of that. There's some talk of a much tighter defence alliance, but you can see that even if there is a tighter defence alliance, then that that certain things would be demanded of Britain as a counterpart. So, for instance, it might be asked of Britain and Starmer and the Labour government that Britain associates itself far more closely with collective defence procurement. And that would mean probably buying an awful lot of defence equipment from France in particular, but other European countries too, which would probably mean that there would be a big hit for a number of British defence companies. So there are all sorts of, and then on the foreign policy level, there are a number of differences that I think show up between the way Britain views the world and how the EU views the world. And what worries me in particular is that there could be some kind of diminution of the way we have developed alliances since emerging from Brexit. So the AUKUS alliance with the Australians and the Americans, which it seems to me is an important alliance for the future of Britain internationally, that could suffer if there is too much closing the gap with the European Union on defence issues. Because defence issues, the way the European Union sees them, are not very close to those of Great Britain when outside of the European Union is concerned.
Well, it certainly ought to be a warning to Starmer and the government to keep a safe distance, or as safe a distance as possible, from an EU that is increasingly shaky and economically dysfunctional. Whether it will do that or not, it's anyone's guess. And the problem is, I think, that many people in Britain who are strongly committed to close relations with the EU are not really very interested in the EU or in European politics. And it seems to me that what they're really interested in is making sure that Brexit is defeated and that the Brexiteers are not seen as being having been right or politically successful. So they keep producing all sorts of completely bogus and unbelievable statistics proving the damage that's been done by Brexit, all of which are very easily disproved, which still get repeated in all the usual anti-Brexit media. So, and of course, as we know, this attitude is very strong within the Labour Party. So if Starmer is rational, he will, I suppose, make certain gestures of friendship towards the EU and say there's been a reset and go on visits and so on, and actually change nothing, because there's very little that we need from the EU. The economic effects of Brexit have been negligible. And we have a treaty, a free trade treaty with the EU. What we should be doing, as John has suggested, is looking elsewhere both for our trading and for our strategic partnerships, because the EU is simply not a viable partner. Okay, we've got to try and prop up European defence, clearly, but that should not be, I think, through the EU. It should be through bilateral relationships with countries like Poland and Sweden and the Baltic states, not by going through some sort of central EU institutions which have over and over again proved to be ineffective and largely, as John suggested, drawn up to benefit particular interests within the EU.
If Starmer is rational is certainly a big if. My final question, gentlemen, goes to the future. One of the interesting insights, Robert, I thought was to say that the Constitution and the system isn't so much of an issue, and it's a sugar hit to suggest that that is what we need to look at if you're looking to fix some of the problems within France. As you reflect on the country today at what is no doubt a very, very grave moment, how would you think about what the country needs to do to reform and how it should go about doing that?
Well, it's strange. I mean, I think what the things that we've been saying are that these are very deep problems, and they're also not problems confined to France. There's a paradox about the Fifth Republic, I suppose, which is that it's been a very successful system. It's governed France, or France has been governed under it for how many years is it now? John will know, but for several generations. And it's been, in that sense, more successful than most of its predecessors. And yet, the particular crisis that France is now in, which you could say is the French version of a global crisis or a Western crisis, is very much linked with particular aspects of the Fifth Republic Constitution. So, in a way, you have it both ways. It's been a very successful system, but now it's showing all its vices. And I remember the distinguished French journalist Jean-Marie, I think it was, Revel, saying it's such a dangerous, the Fifth Republic is such a dangerous instruction manual that it would be criminal to put it into the hands even of a saint. And there haven't been many saints who've been presidents of the Republic. So you might say the logic of French history is there'll now be a swing back towards a more parliamentary system, that Parliament will be given more authority, the President less authority. But whether that will actually solve any of France's problems I wouldn't guess. Historians don't like making predictions about the future because we know that they're always wrong. But nevertheless, we have to keep trying.
John, your final thoughts?
Yes, well, as Robert suggested right at the beginning, I mean, France has had 16 different constitutions since 1789. And many of those have been fairly short-lived. The Fifth Republic has done very well since 1958 in many ways. But what its strength rested on, is that there always should be a majority within the National Assembly. And now we've come to the point where there is no majority in the National Assembly, and it is weakening considerably the basic structures of the whole of the Constitution. Now, there is talk of things moving on to a sixth republic. There are some political parties who are distinctly in favour of that. The Jean-Luc Mélenchon, we haven't mentioned him, the radical left-wing firebrand who is in favour of a sixth republic, would certainly fight for that to happen. There are other parties that would also favour, probably, some form of modification of the Constitution anyway. So everything really comes down now to what's going to happen in the next 3 or maybe 6 months. There could be a point where the whole system goes into crisis, and as a result of that, it is thought afterwards that there should be some kind of committee set up that would decide whether a new kind of constitution should be developed, because maybe majorities of the kind that used to exist in the past are no longer going to exist in the future, and therefore this kind of thing could recur often.
It's food for thought. I was speaking with Dominic Sandbrook the other day, and he was saying that now is precisely the time when the French are weak to finally vanquish them once and for all. So we'll see whether or not Keir Starmer chooses to take up that particular line. Robert, John, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.
Pleasure.
Thank you.